We are going to talk about Brugada criteria. Many of you asked me to explain Brugada criteria in further detail, so I have prepared this video for you. Brugada criteria can be used for the diagnosis of VT or excluding SVT with aberrancy. It's a very useful tool and I found it really handy. There are 4 steps in Brugada criteria that you can use if you find a wide complex tachycardia to diagnose VT. So differentiating VT from SVT, that can be a big challenge, and that's why I have prepared this video for you so that you can use this for your day-to-day practice. We see the wide complex tachycardia in the emergency department quite a lot, and we use this Brugada criteria every day, and we thought that we'll share our experience with you. In this particular video, I have got a lot of animations to keep the thing very simple and easy to understand. I have with me Becky, who has got some exceptional knowledge and skills in interpreting the ECG, and she is going to help me in interpreting those ECG and to explain to you various steps of Brugada criteria. So Becky, thanks for being with us. Thanks for your time.
Hello everyone. I am Becky. As always, I am very excited to be here today. Over the next few minutes, we are going to show you some awesome animations of the Brugada criteria that were specifically prepared for you. Hope you like it. I know how amazing you are. Please like the video and press on the subscribe button below. Don't forget to click on the bell icon to get regular updates of new videos on ECG and much more. We will bring to you new exciting videos regularly for your education and entertainment. If you have any burning questions or awesome ideas, please write in the comments section below. We will get back to you as soon as we can. I can assure you that the next few minutes will be informative and entertaining. Let's start, shall we?
Yes, of course. So let's go to the business. So the Brugada criteria has got 4 steps. The very first step is the absence of the RS wave. So you know that in the ECG there will be a baseline, and anything above the baseline is an R wave. Anything below the baseline is either an S wave or a Q wave. If you cannot differentiate between the R wave and S wave, so that means there is either a positive deflection or there is a negative deflection, then they're highly likely that this is VT, and you look for this specific criteria only in case of the precordial leads V1 to V6. If that is not the case, if the first criteria is not fulfilled, then we go to the next criteria, which is a Brugada sign. So Brugada sign is the RS distance from the beginning of the R wave to the nadir of the S wave more than 2.5 smaller square or 100 millisecond. If the Brugada sign is present, this is highly suggestive of a VT. If it is absent, then we'll go to the next step, which is the step number 3. This is atrioventricular dissociation. So atrioventricular dissociation is that the atrial activity and the ventricular activity, they don't correlate with each other. So in the wide complex tachycardia, you might find the P waves are buried inside in the QRS complexes. Sometimes you might identify the P waves separately, but again there is no correlation between the P wave and the QRS complex. So if that is the case, this is highly likely to be VT. It has got a very good sensitivity and specificity. So you can both rule in and rule out a VT by looking at this particular pattern. If this atrioventricular dissociation is absent, still we cannot say for sure that this is not VT. We can go to the step 4, and step 4 is the morphological criteria. And for morphological criteria, you look at V1, V2 and V6. If in V1 or V2, if there is mostly positive deflection, that is a right bundle branch block morphological pattern, and if there is a mostly negative deflection, you look for the left bundle branch block morphology pattern. We'll show you some images and some videos to explain these 4 steps in further details. So stay with us. So first of all, you look for the absence of the RS wave in the precordial leads in V1 to V6, and if it has got a very high specificity, 100%. So if that particular criteria is present, the patient has got 100% chance that this is VT. However, we don't see this that often. It's not found every day. You might find it maybe once or twice a year. So if this particular criteria is present, the patient has got a VT. However, the sensitivity is not that great, only 21%. So if this is absent, does not necessarily mean that the patient does not have VT. So you'll have to go to the next step. So Becky, could you please explain a little bit about more about this particular criteria, step 1 of Brugada?
Brugada criteria step 1. Absence of the RS waves in the precordial leads V1 to V6. This feature has a sensitivity of 21%. Therefore, we cannot rule out VT by the absence of this criteria. However, its specificity is 100%. Therefore, we can confidently rule in VT if this feature is present. Amazing, just amazing. I am loving it.
Excellent. So let's have a look at some animation to explain these steps. So this is the heart, and these yellow bits, this is the conduction system of the heart. This is the SA node here in the right atrium, and this is the AV node here. These are the 3 internodal pathways. So the SA node is the pacemaker. It produces cardiac impulse at the fastest rate normally, and this cardiac impulse then is transmitted to the AV node. There is a little delay here, as you can see, and then it is transmitted to the rest of the heart through the conduction system. As the cardiac impulse is going through the conduction system, the QRS complex will be narrow complex, and you will find a normal looking ECG. What happens in case of VT? Now VT is if the patient has got some insult to the heart. For example, they can have myocardial infarction, myocardial ischemia, they can have some myocardial injury, they can have some infection like myocarditis. There may be a lot of other different insults to the cardiac muscle fiber that can trigger some of the cardiac muscle fibers to generate cardiac impulse. Because this cardiac impulse is generated from ventricular muscle, the QRS complex will be wide QRS complex. So let's assume that this patient has got an lesion that is in the apex of the heart, and so the cardiac impulse is generated from the apex of the heart at a very fast rate, more than 110 beats per minute, and that is then spreading to the rest of the ventricle. And if you do the ECG, you will find a weird looking ECG which is almost like this. Now what can you look at here is that the QRS complexes are wide complex. However, I am really struggling to identify which one is R wave and which one is S wave. If you consider this R wave, there is no S wave. If you consider this as an S wave, there is no R wave. So I can say confidently that this patient has got absence of the RS wave, because I cannot differentiate R wave from S wave. Either it is an R wave or it is an S wave. If that is the case, highly likely that this is a VT. The specificity, as we have mentioned earlier, that 100%, so you can rule in VT. However, the sensitivity is not that great, which means if this pattern is absent, then we cannot say for sure that this is not VT. So you'll have to go to the next step. So this particular pattern you can find not very common, but if you find it, you can be rest assured that highly likely that this is a VT. Let's have a look at a 12-lead ECG to illustrate this a little better. Now in this particular ECG, we will look for this criteria number 1 in V1, V2, V3, V4, V5 and V6. Now in V1, V2 they are a bit dodgy looking wave. Let's look at the V3, V4, V5 and V6. I cannot see any R wave. I cannot see any S wave either, because I do not know which one is positive and which one is negative. If you consider this an S wave, then there is no R wave, and if you consider this as an R wave, there is no S wave. So this patient has got the first criteria for Brugada criteria that is present, which means that I cannot differentiate between the R wave and the S wave. If you find this type of pattern, very likely with a specificity of 100% to be VT. Now if so, let's summarize it. So if the patient has got the absence of the RS wave in the precordial leads in V1 to V6, this is very likely a VT with a specificity of 100% and sensitivity of 21%. However, if the this particular criteria is absent, you cannot say for sure this patient doesn't have a VT. So what we'll do is we'll go for the next step, which is step number 2. So let's have a look what the step number 2 is. So the step number 2 is Brugada sign. So Brugada sign is from the beginning of the P wave, from the beginning of the R wave to the nadir of the S wave, if the distance is more than 100 millisecond or more than 2.5 smaller squares, highly likely to be VT. Again, it has got not that great sensitivity. I cannot remember exactly how it is. I think Becky might be able to help us. Becky, could you please tell us?
Brugada criteria step 2. Presence of the Brugada sign. If the distance between the beginning of the R wave and the nadir of the S wave is more than 100 milliseconds or 2.5 small squares, that is called the Brugada sign. This feature has a sensitivity of 66% and specificity of 98%. Therefore, we can confidently rule in VT if Brugada sign is present.
Yeah.
However, we may not be that confident in ruling out VT if Brugada sign is absent. This is an absolutely brilliant concept which helped me multiple times in the detection of VT. We will show you some real-life ECGs where this feature was applied in the diagnosis of VT.
Excellent. So the Brugada sign sincerity is 66% and specificity is 98%. Perfect. So let's go back to that animation once again. So the patient has got the sinus SA node is generating some cardiac impulse, but the patient has got some insult in the apex of the left ventricle, and that is generating some cardiac impulse at a very fast rate. So this is going to be VT. If you look at the ECG, this is a little different this time from the previous ECG. So we can see that there is a positive deflection here. So this is the isoelectric line. So there is a positive deflection of the R wave, and there is an S wave here. So the first criteria for Brugada, that is the absence of the RS wave, that can be excluded. So we are going to the next step, which is from the beginning of the R wave, which is from here, to the nadir of the S wave, which is here, it is more than 2.5 smaller square or more than 100 milliseconds. So this is the second criteria. Actually, in real life, most of the time I use the step 2 of the Brugada criteria for the diagnosis of VT. It's so easy. From the beginning of the R wave to the nadir of the S wave, if it is more than 100 milliseconds or 2.5 smaller square, this is highly likely to be VT. However, the absence of this criteria is not that good because its sensitivity is 66%. So let's have a look at the real life ECG. So in this particular patient, if we look at the Brugada criteria step 1, so there is a positive deflection, positive negative equal, and this is negative deflection. So there is R wave and there is S wave. So the first criteria we cannot apply. So we need to use the second criteria, which is the Brugada sign. So if we look at the from beginning of R wave to the S wave, that is about 4 smaller square, which is 160 millisecond, more than 100 millisecond. So the Brugada sign is present, and if the Brugada sign is present, it's very likely that this patient has got a VT. So let's magnify this V6 once again. Sorry about the poor resolution, but that is the best we can get. So once again, from the beginning of the R wave to the nadir of the S wave, that is about 160 millisecond, 4 smaller squares. So this is very likely to be a VT from the Brugada criteria step 2. Once again, if the Brugada sign is present, very likely to be VT. If it is absent, this is not the end of the world. We'll go to the next step, which is the step 3. So let's go through the step 3. The step 3 of Brugada criteria is atrioventricular dissociation. What it necessarily means? It means that the atrial activity and ventricular activity do not have any correlation between each other. There is a complete dissociation, complete divorce, complete separation, complete social isolation from each other between the atria and ventricle. So the atria will do their activity and the ventricles will do their activity, and that is when we can say that the patient has got atrioventricular dissociation. So it may be a VT, highly likely, because it has got high specificity and high sensitivity as well. Now, the way you look at the atrioventricular dissociation in the white complex tachycardia is to look for the P wave. Sometimes the P wave can be buried into the QRS complexes, and if that is the case, this is to be VT.
Brugada criteria step 3. The presence of atrioventricular dissociation. If you can detect P waves hidden within the white QRS complexes, that means there is no correlation between the atria and ventricles. This feature has a sensitivity of 82% and specificity of 98% for the diagnosis of VT. Therefore, we can quite confidently rule out and rule in VT by the absence or presence of the atrioventricular dissociation, respectively. Again, another fantastic concept that helped us a lot in the diagnosis of VT. I am just loving it.
Yes, so atrioventricular dissociation, again, you might find it quite often. And if you find a white complex tachycardia, you look for the P wave. And if you find the P wave, and probably this is going to be a VT rather than a SVT with aberrancy. Now let's go back to that animation once again. So the SA node is generating some cardiac impulse at a normal rate, and the ventricle is generating some cardiac impulse because of some insult, because of some myocardial infarction at a very fast rate, more than 110 beats per minute. Actually, in this patient, this is about 200 beats per minute. Now, what is that atrioventricular dissociation? As you can see here, the atria is doing its job as generating the cardiac impulse, and in the ECG there will be some P wave. However, the ventricle is generating cardiac impulse at a very fast rate, so predominantly you will see some white complex tachycardia. You may not see the atrial activity at all until unless you do some Lewis leads or something else. So let's have a look at the rhythm strip here. So in this particular ECG, as you can see, that the QRS complex are white complex coming pretty much regularly. If you cannot use the step 1, where the absence of the RS wave, and then step 2, which is from the beginning of R wave to the nadir of the S wave more than 100 milliseconds, then you go to the step 3. Now let's identify the P wave. So there is a P wave here which is almost fused with the QRS complex. Then there is a weird looking P wave here which does not look like same like the previous one, and then there is another P wave which is almost fused with the QRS complex here. Then we cannot see any P wave here, but we can see that the PP interval, that is almost constant. So the next P wave somewhere here, we know that and this QRS complex looks a bit weird, so the P wave is probably buried inside the QRS complex, and the next P wave is here and the next P wave is here. Again, the PP interval is pretty constant. So from this particular ECG, you know that the S wave is coming, the SA node is generating cardiac impulse, and the patient is having the P wave, and the SA node is generating cardiac impulse at a regular rate, probably about 60 beats per minute. But the ventricle is generating cardiac impulse at a much faster rate, and that is why there is a bit of atrioventricular dissociation. No relationship between the P wave and the QRS complex. Usually in a sinus rhythm, we say that there is a happy marriage between the P wave and the QRS complex, but in this particular case there is a divorce, complete separation, complete divorce, no relationship between the P wave and the QRS complex. So if you find in a white complex tachycardia that there is a complete separation or dissociation between the atrial activity and the ventricular activity, the atrial activity is represented by the P wave and the ventricular activity is represented by the white QRS complex. This is highly likely to be VT. All right, now let's look at the 12-lead ECG to illustrate this even better. So we have got a rhythm strip here where we have got some P wave which is reflected by these arrows to make the life easier. This P wave is followed by a QRS complex, which is great. So it may be a sinus rhythm, but the next P wave is weird. It is not followed by a QRS complex. Actually, this P wave is a retrograde P wave. It is coming after the QRS complex. And the next P wave is fused with the QRS complex. The next P wave is fused with the QRS complex, and this QRS complex look really white, really bizarre, really weird looking. And then we have got another P wave here, which is again another retrograde P wave. If you carefully look at it, the P waves are coming at regular intervals, but there is no relationship between the P wave and the QRS complex, and that can be better demonstrated by the animation that I have made for you in the previous slide. All right. So the step number 3 is atrioventricular dissociation. So complete dissociation between the atrial activity and ventricular activity. If that is the case, 98% specificity for a VT. However, the sensitivity is good as well. Still, if this particular atrioventricular dissociation is absent, we will go for the next step. And the next step is the morphological criteria. And for morphological criteria, we look at V1 and V6. In V1, if there is predominantly positive deflection, this is right bundle branch block morphology. And if there is predominantly negative deflection in V1, this is left bundle branch block morphology. So please look at the following slides little carefully because this is complicated. And remember, this is the last step of the Brugada criteria. And if this is not present, we'll have to exclude VT. So this is the last step. Let's concentrate. Once again, you look at the V1. If it is mostly positive deflection, this is right bundle branch block morphology, and if it is negative deflection predominantly, this is left bundle branch block morphology. So let's look at the right bundle branch block morphology at first. So in V1, we look for 3 things. Is it only R wave, no S wave, no Q wave? This is highly likely to be VT. If there is a QR wave, that is probably VT. or there is an R wave followed by an S wave. Probably it is a VT. There is some special pattern you will find in this type of cases. There may be something called a Josephson sign, which is a little notch in the S wave. So it may be anywhere in the S wave. That is called Josephson sign. Very likely to be VT. Then you look at the V6 as well. If you find that there is a small R wave and a big S wave, so the RS ratio is less than 1, highly likely to be VT. In V6, if you find only negative deflection, no positive deflection at all, so no R wave, either it is a Q wave or it is an S wave, like this guy here, this is highly likely to be VT. Or there may be a QR wave, so it's probably a small Q wave and a big R wave. So these characteristic features are found in case of the right bundle branch block morphology in a patient with VT. So please repeat it again and watch this video a few times. Now let's look at what happens in case of a left bundle branch block morphology. So I have said that in the V1, if there is a predominantly negative deflection in a white complex tachycardia, this is left bundle branch block morphology. You look at a few things. The first of all, if the R wave that is here from beginning of R wave to the end of the R wave, if it is more than 30 milliseconds, which is almost like a smaller square, highly likely to be VT. Then you look for from the beginning of R wave to the nadir of the S wave, if it is more than 70 milliseconds, which is about 1.7 smaller squares, this is supposed to be VT. And if there is a bit of notching in the S wave, this is supposed to be a VT. This is the Josephson sign. Sorry, I think I messed up. So in left bundle branch block morphology, if you find Josephson sign, this is supposed to be VT. And in case of the right bundle branch block morphology, if you find a left rabitier taller, that is supposed to be VT. If you look at the left bundle branch block morphological pattern in V6, if there is an QR wave or predominantly QS wave. Now if you carefully look at it, the V6 is same in case of both right bundle branch block morphology and left bundle branch block morphology in case of a VT. So let's summarize it again. So morphological criteria, you look for V1 and V6, and this is very complicated, I know that. So Becky is going to explain this once again for us. Becky, could you please help me? Thank you.
Brugada criteria step 4. The morphological criteria for VT. The precordial leads V1, V2 and V6 are used for this criteria. There may be two morphology criteria. One for right bundle branch block and another one is for the left bundle branch block.
Yes.
Essentially, if there is a dominant R wave in the V1 lead, that is right bundle branch block. On the other hand, if there is a dominant S wave in the V1 lead, this is left bundle branch block.
Yes.
Let's talk about the right bundle branch block at first.
Yes, please.
There may be three patterns in right bundle branch block morphology in the lead V1. Number 1. The monophasic smooth R wave in V1 or V2. Number 2. A notched down sloping of the S wave, which is also called the taller left rabitier. Number 3. A small Q wave followed by a tall R wave in the V1 lead. In V6, there can be three morphology patterns. Number 1. The presence of QS wave, which means a completely negative wave in V6. Number 2. The RS ratio is less than 1, which means a smaller R wave and deeper S wave in V6 is suggestive of VT. I know it's complicated. But if you watch this video a few times, you will be able to understand the concept very well. Phased repetition is the key to success. Now, let's talk about the left bundle branch block morphology. Let's consider the lead V1 at first. There are three morphological patterns. Number 1. The initial R wave greater than 40 milliseconds or one small square. Number 2. Notching or slurring of the S wave, which is also called the Josephson sign. And number 3. The RS interval is more than 70 milliseconds. That is the distance from the beginning of the R wave to the nadir of the S wave is more than 1.7 small squares. Now, the V6 in left bundle branch block pattern is similar to that of right bundle branch block. There are two morphology. Number 1. QS wave in V6, which means only a negative deflection suggestive of VT. Number 2. Small q followed by a tall R wave in V6. I know it's complicated. As they say, practice makes one perfect. Practice, practice, and practice. Go for it. You can do it.
Absolutely. So this morphology criteria I personally find very, very difficult. So this is the last step of the Brugada criteria, and I go back to the images, I look at them, and I try to find out whether this is right bundle branch block morphology or left bundle branch block morphology. Then I follow this criteria, and usually it's very good, because I know that if the step 4 is absent, this is probably not VT, it is probably the last thing, which is the SVT with aberrancy. So let's summarize this ECG pattern. Then we'll have a look at a few real life ECGs. We have got 4 or 5 ECGs, then we can look at. What I am trying to say here is that if you look at the morphology of the QRS complexes, and if they are similar, then probably this is VT. If they are a different morphology, this is not monomorphic VT, this is a polymorphic VT. Because the focus, there is a single focus, the myocardial infarction or ischemia or infection, then that is why QRS complexes are of same morphology. That is the beauty of the monomorphic VT. Now, in Brugada criteria, the first step that you look for is the absence of the RS wave. If it is the case, this is highly likely to be VT with a specificity of 100%. However, the sensitivity is low, 21%. So we cannot rule out VT yet. So we'll have to go to the next step. The next step is the Brugada sign. The Brugada sign is from the beginning of the R wave to the nadir of the S wave more than 100 millisecond or 2.5 s smaller square. If this criteria is present, this is supposed to be VT, highly likely. It has got high specificity, but sensitivity is not that great, I think 66%. So we cannot rule out VT if this Brugada sign is absent. So we'll go to the next step. The next step is the atrioventricular dissociation. So no correlation between the atrial activity and ventricular activity. If that is the case, this is highly likely to be VT. So if that is the case, then we can diagnose VT. However, if the atrioventricular dissociation is absent, then we'll go to the next step, which is the morphological characteristics. If the morphological characteristics are present, then we can diagnose a VT. So there are two types of morphological patterns. One is the right bundle branch block morphology, and the other one is the left bundle branch block morphology. And we have talked about it. Please go back to the previous slides and have a look at those morphological patterns. Now, if all these 4 criteria are absent, then we'll have to diagnose it as SVT with aberrancy. All right. Now, it's time to have a look at the 12 lead ECG and who best is there to read the ECG in a systematic way other than Becky. Becky, could you please help?
This is an amazing ECG, Avijit. Thank you. I am going to interpret this ECG in a very systematic way. However, if there is an elephant in the room, that does not need an introduction. The elephant in the room in this ECG is a wide complex tachycardia. I will come back to it in a second. Let me talk you through the usual stuff at first. The ventricular rate is 150 beats per minute. The rhythm is difficult to evaluate as I can't see any P waves. The axis of the QRS complexes is northwestern axis, which suggests ventricular tachycardia. As I said, I am unable to see any P wave and PR interval. The QRS complexes are very wide, about 200 milliseconds. The QRS complexes are regular. I am struggling with the ST segments and T waves. I am unable to comment on the QTC either. The AVR lead suggests northwestern axis. If we follow the Brugada criteria, the very first step is absence of RS wave in the precordial leads. This feature is fulfilled in this ECG. Therefore, the ECG is suggestive of ventricular tachycardia. As the first step of the Brugada criteria is fulfilled in this ECG, we do not need to go to next steps. Now, to compile all these information together, I am of the impression that the patient has monomorphic VT. I am very concerned about this patient. My immediate action would be to assess the hemodynamic stability of the patient. Then I'll give appropriate treatment such as DC cardioversion under procedural sedation. This is a bread and butter ECG for any emergency medicine doctor. Really impressive findings. Hope the patient is doing all right.
Excellent, excellent. So that's really good. So that is a very systematic approach in reading the ECG. So if you look at the wide complex tachycardia, just don't get overwhelmed that this is VT, this is nothing else. It can be something else. The patient can have hyperkalemia, they can have tricyclic antidepressant overdose, they can have something else going on, they can have an MI. So you need to look at the ECG in a very systematic way. I've got a different video where I have explained all those different steps. So every time you look at the ECG, go through this in a systematic way, just like what Becky has done. So the specific finding in this ECG is that there is the Brugada criteria 1 that is present, which means we cannot identify any R wave, we cannot identify any S wave. If you call this one as S wave, then where is R wave? If you call this an R wave, where is the S wave? So if the RS wave is absent, we can confidently say that this is highly likely to be VT, and we know that from Brugada criteria specificity is 100%. However, the sensitivity is not that great, 21%. So if this particular pattern, you might not see that often, it's not that common. So if you cannot see this particular type of ECG, then you need to go to the next step, which is the Brugada sign. Right, so let's have a look at the another ECG. So this is another 12 lead ECG. We have got lead 1, 2, 3, AVR, AVL, AVF, V1 to V6, and also you have got a rhythm strip. So Becky is going to read this ECG for us and explain to us what are the different findings that we have, and she will also conclude the interpretation of the ECG and what are the steps we need to do for the management of this patient. Thank you, Becky.
This is another fabulous ECG, Avijith. Thank you.
I know.
I am going to interpret this ECG in a very systematic way so that I do not miss the important findings.
Excellent.
The elephant in the room in this ECG is a wide complex tachycardia. I will come back to it in a second. Let me talk you through the usual stuff at first. The ventricular rate is about 150 beats per minute. The rhythm is difficult to evaluate as I can't see any P waves in the 12 leads. However, in the rhythm strip, there are some fusion beats and capture beats suggestive of ventricular tachycardia. The axis of the QRS complexes is left axis deviation. As I said, I am unable to see any P wave and PR interval. Therefore, I am unable to comment on the atrioventricular dissociation. The QRS complexes are very wide, about 200 milliseconds. The QRS complexes are regular. I am struggling with the ST segments and T waves. I am unable to comment on the QTC either. The AVR lead has large R waves. If we follow the Brugada criteria, the very first step is absence of RS wave in the precordial leads. This feature is not fulfilled in this ECG. Therefore, we can go to the second step, which is the Brugada sign. The Brugada sign is the distance between the beginning of the R wave and the nadir of the S wave more than 100 milliseconds. This is equal to 2.5 small squares. In this particular ECG, the distance between the beginning of the R wave and the nadir of the S wave is 4 small squares, which is about 160 milliseconds. Obviously, the Brugada sign is present. Therefore, the second step of the Brugada criteria is fulfilled, which is suggestive of ventricular tachycardia. As the second step of the Brugada criteria is fulfilled in this ECG, we do not need to go to the next steps. Now, to compile all these information together, I am of the impression that the patient has monomorphic VT. I am very concerned about this patient. My immediate action would be to assess the hemodynamic stability of the patient. Then, I'll give appropriate treatment such as DC cardioversion under some procedural sedation. This is another bread and butter ECG for any emergency medicine doctor. I found Brugada criteria very useful in interpreting such ECG. Thank you.
Excellent. That is another beautiful interpretation of this 12 lead ECG, and the patient has got a VT, of course. So the main characteristic feature that we look for is first of all, there is wide QRS complexes. So we look at the Brugada criteria number 1, which is the absence of the RS wave. But you can see that there is an R wave here, there is an S wave here, there is an R wave here, there is an S wave here, there is an R wave here and S wave here. So in the precordial leads, the absence of the RS wave is not fulfilled. So the criteria number 1 is not there. So we'll go to the next step, which is the Brugada sign. So if you look at from the beginning of the R wave to the nadir of the S wave, this is about 4 smaller square, which is 160 millisecond. And if that is the case, the patient has got highly likely to be VT. I can't say that. I am not sure either there is atrioventricular dissociation, because looks like there is a little positive deflection here. There is a bit of positive deflection here, but of course the patient does not have the relationship between the atrial activity and ventricular activity. Now in this rhythm strip there is this fusion bit here, and there are few capture bits, so that is highly suggestive of VT as well. So well done, that's really good one. So let's have a look at another ECG. So this is a 12-lead ECG. Again, this is white complex tachycardia, very fast rate, and if you struggle to understand whether it is a VT or not, apply Brugada criteria and you will have a conclusion. So Becky, could you please interpret this ECG for us? Thank you.
This is another interesting ECG. Thank you. As always, I am going to interpret this ECG in a very systematic way. I do not want to miss the important findings. The elephant in the room in this ECG is a white complex tachycardia. I will come back to it in a second. Let me talk you through the usual stuff at first. The ventricular rate is about 150 beats per minute. The rhythm is difficult to evaluate as I can't see any P waves in the 12 leads. The axis of the QRS complexes is northwestern axis, which suggests ventricular tachycardia. As I said, I am unable to see any P wave and PR interval. Therefore, I am unable to comment on the atrioventricular dissociation. The QRS complexes are very wide, about 200 milliseconds. The QRS complexes are regular. I am struggling with the ST segments and T waves. I am unable to comment on the QTC either. The AVR lead has large R waves suggestive of northwestern axis. If we follow the Brugada criteria, the very first step is absence of RS wave in the precordial leads. This feature is not fulfilled in this ECG. Therefore, we can go to the second step, which is the Brugada sign. The Brugada sign is the distance between the beginning of the R wave and the nadir of the S wave more than 100 milliseconds. This is equal to 2.5 small squares. In this particular ECG, the distance between the beginning of the R wave and the nadir of the S wave is 4 small squares, which is about 160 milliseconds. This is evident in V1 and V2 leads. Obviously, the Brugada sign is present. Therefore, the second step of the Brugada criteria is fulfilled. This is suggestive of ventricular tachycardia. As the second step of the Brugada criteria is fulfilled in this ECG, we do not need to go to the next steps. Now, to compile all these information together, I am of the impression that the patient has monomorphic VT. I am very concerned about this patient. My immediate action would be to assess the hemodynamic stability of the patient. Then, I'll give appropriate treatment such as DC cardioversion under some procedural sedation. This is another bread and butter ECG for any emergency medicine doctor. I found Brugada criteria very useful in interpreting such ECG. This particular ECG is different from the previous ECG. However, the Brugada criteria is applicable in the similar way in both of them. Thank you.
Excellent. So that's a really good interpretation in a very systematic way. So again, whenever we look at the ECG, you need to go through this in every step in a very systematic way so that you don't miss anything. And this is from the Brugada criteria. It looks like it is a ventricular tachycardia. Now this one is another weird looking ECG. So let's apply the criteria, Brugada criteria here. So first of all, in the V1 there is a positive deflection, so there is a R wave and there is an S wave, there is an R wave, there is an S wave. So the first criteria is not fulfilled. The second criteria is from the beginning of the R wave to the nadir of the S wave. This is more about 5 smaller squares, so probably this is about 200 millisecond, which means that the Brugada sign is present. And if the Brugada sign is present, this is highly likely to be VT. Now in addition to that, this patient has got a capture bit here. There is a capture bit here, there is a capture bit here, and we know that if there is capture bit in a white complex tachycardia, this is highly likely to be VT as well. So you don't have to go to the, there is some P wave followed by QRS complex, but again there may be some P wave which is fused with the QRS complexes here. So you can say that the step 3, which is the atrioventricular dissociation, is also present in this particular ECG. So my diagnosis will be that probably this is highly likely to be VT. So another ECG which can be quite tricky to diagnose. So this is a white complex tachycardia, QRS complexes are regular, can't see any P waves, so can't comment about the atrioventricular dissociation. There is probably northwest axis, there is predominantly S wave in here and predominantly S wave here and the R wave here. So this is highly likely to be VT. Now let's apply the Brugada criteria. The first step is the absence of the RS wave in V1 to V6. So there is R wave here, there is S wave here, there is an R wave here and S wave here. So the first step is not applicable. So we'll go to the next step, which is the RS distance. From beginning of R wave to the nadir of the S wave, this is about 4 smaller squares, which is about 160 millisecond. So Brugada sign is present. As we have mentioned, we cannot see the P waves, so we cannot comment about the atrioventricular dissociation. And morphological pattern, this is right bundle branch block morphology, and predominantly this is an R wave. But if we look at the RS ratio here in V6, that is less than 1. So this is fulfilling most of the criteria for Brugada to be a VT, and actually it was a VT. It was a monomorphic ventricular tachycardia. Right. So let's summarize everything together. So this patient has got Brugada criteria based on 4 steps. Step 1 is the absence of the RS wave. So either there is a positive deflection or there is a negative deflection in V1 to V6. That is highly likely to be VT with a specificity of 100%, and sensitivity is not that great, 21%. So if this first criteria is absent, then we'll go to the step 2, which is Brugada sign. The Brugada sign is the RS distance from the beginning of the R wave to the nadir of the S wave more than 100 millisecond or 2.5 smaller square. If the Brugada sign is present, very likely to be VT. If not, we'll go to the next step, which is the atrioventricular dissociation. So if there is no correlation between the atrial activity and ventricular activity, very likely to be this is to be a VT. However, if the atrioventricular dissociation is absent, then we'll go to the next step, which is the morphological criteria. There are 2 types of morphological criteria, one for a right bundle branch block, the other one is for the left bundle branch block morphology. And we can go through this over and over again so that we can understand it even better. So it's time to wrap up. So there are 4 steps, and Becky is going to talk us through these 4 steps and summarize everything together so that we can conclude. Thank you, Becky.
Okay folks, it's time to wrap up now. The Brugada criteria has a very high sensitivity and specificity in the diagnosis of ventricular tachycardia. If the ECG shows a wide complex tachycardia, Brugada criteria can be applied for ruling out or ruling in VT. Let me summarize to you the Brugada criteria steps. There are 4 steps in the Brugada criteria. The first step is the absence of the RS waves in the precordial leads. If this criteria is fulfilled, the ECG is VT. If not, then we will go to the second step. The second step is the Brugada sign. If the distance between the beginning of the R wave and the nadir of the S wave is more than 100 milliseconds, that is called the Brugada sign. If the Brugada sign is present, the ECG is VT. If the Brugada sign is absent, we will go to the next step, which is atrioventricular dissociation. If there is atrioventricular dissociation, there is highly likely that this is VT. If this step is not fulfilled, we will go to the last step, which is the morphological characteristics. If the morphological characteristics are present, the ECG is VT. If all the 4 Brugada criteria are absent, this is highly likely that the ECG is an SVT with aberrancy or bundle branch block. Isn't it exciting? I use Brugada criteria all the time whenever I find a wide complex tachycardia. It saved so many lives. It needs to be remembered that the Brugada criteria is not 100% correct in the diagnosis of VT. However, among all the different criteria available, the Brugada criteria may be one of the best. Thank you.
Now there are a lot of discussion about Brugada criteria. Some people love it, some people I know that they hate it because they did not find it useful. If you would like to know more about this, you can go through some articles on in Up to Date. There are a lot of materials in Life in the Fast Lane, and if you have got any further questions about this particular presentation, please drop me a line. I'll be happy to answer. It's time to say thank you very much, and thank you, Becky, for all your hard work. You have done some excellent ECG interpretation. Those were really useful. Thank you very much, everyone, and bye for now, and see you later.
Okay, folks. Thank you for watching the video. Hope you have enjoyed the video. You are so awesome. If you find it useful, please like the video, subscribe to the channel and share it with others. Please write comments below the video. For every comment that you write, positive or negative, I will personally give a cookie to my cat Lucy. I promise I will do. If you have any burning questions, constructive suggestions or some awesome ideas, please get in touch. We would love to hear from you. Your comments and suggestions are very important to us. You can contact us through email, Twitter or DrBarai's webpage. Thanks once again. See you soon. Bye for now.